We're going to be turning to Matthew chapter 16 as we've been walking through the book of Matthew. If you need to use one of the Bibles that's in front of us, in the pew in front of you, we're going to be on page 1524. And so just want to encourage you to go ahead and have a Bible in front of you. It's so much easier to follow along with that Bible. But I'll say this as you're turning there, it's good to be back. Carrie Ann and I took a week to get away and get some rest, kind of the silence before the storm. Folks have been walking up to me all morning with their tongue out. If you have Facebook, you know why. I posted a picture. I stuck out my tongue to my daughter the other day, and she stuck it out back. And so I took it as a photo opportunity, and so many of y'all have seen that. It was a great time. We spent some time with family. We played spades. I don't know if you get in competition. We put stats on the fridge of our spades games, and so we had a great time staying up and doing that. We went to the beach a couple times, and Pepper learned that while she can drop crackers on the floor and pick them up, if you drop crackers on the beach and pick them up and put them in your mouth, they're a little bit more crunchy than they were before. So we had a great time. We went to some of those outside malls, the outlet malls where you go and you buy mistakes essentially. So we went to the outlet malls and we had a great time. One of the things that I was amazed as we were walking through some of these outlet malls, there wasn't one store that I think that did not have 50% off or more. Okay, they have to do that, I guess, to attract you and to get you in there. And I got to be honest. I think that whole thing is rigged. You walk in and you look at it and you go, $100 for a T-shirt just doesn't seem reasonable for me, And so we would kind of walk in, we walk out. We did find some good deals there, but there's always those things that you see. You go to the clearance rack. I mean, you can do that even here. You go to the clearance rack and it's 75% off, and there's this tension that takes place when you see that, because on the one hand, it's 75% off. On the other hand, it's ugly as sin. And so you're going, man, I can get that really cheap, but I can't think of a time that I'm gonna wear it. So we passed that up, but we found some good deals. But it reminded me of our nature. It reminded me of even my nature, and that nature is this: we want the best possible item for the least price. Isn't that right? We want the best possible item that you can give us for the least possible price. I don't know if you've ever done this. When I was younger, I worked a job that after taxes, I made $5 an hour. And so I was in high school making that big $5 an hour. But I don't know if you've ever done this. If you work an hourly job, then you might think like this. I remember if you go on a date or something, then you're thinking, man, if I spend that's a day and a half of work. Did you ever do that kind of math in your mind? You're thinking, man, that's going to cost me 4 or 5 hours, And so you got to kind of put those things together. And so, again, our nature is to get the best possible item for the least price. But the Bible says that there is a price for something. It's so beautiful. It's so magnificent that it is worth everything you have. And you know what that is? It's a relationship with Jesus Christ. I'm telling you, I think about, a lot of people call Christianity a religion. And if you want to go that road, that's fine. But religion works its way to God. But for us, that we say a relationship with Jesus, that's what it's all about. In fact, I'll just show you these real quick up here. I'm going to post them up here. I might need to get some help to post them up here. There we go. Get some Bible verses up here. Matthew chapter 13, verse 44 says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. And when a man found it, he hid it again. And then in his joy, he went," and look at this, "sold all he had and bought that field." In other words, this is a parable, by the way. And so it's explaining, it's making an analogy here, like a relationship with Jesus. It's like having this treasure that he finds in a field. And so he goes and he hides it and he says, "I'm going to sell everything that I have because I want this treasure." That's what the relationship with Jesus is like. Second verse that's here is Matthew 13, 45 through 46. It says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. And when he found one of great value, he went away." And again, look at this. He sold everything that he had, and he bought it. And so here it's saying, look, a relationship with Jesus Christ is worth everything. It's worth everything that you have. And so here I want us to take a look this morning in Matthew chapter 16 as Jesus begins to talk about this together. So you might pull out your notes. And we're going to see this morning the three prices that Jesus is going to talk about. And so that's why I've given you three price tags. And so we'll get to that in just a minute. But we're going to look at Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 21. And what we're going to see here is that right at this point in the Gospel of Matthew is that we're going to see Jesus begin to go towards Jerusalem. He's moving towards his crucifixion. Up until this point, he has been doing nothing but ministry, okay? He has been healing the blind. He has been healing the sick. He's been preaching the good news. He's been teaching the gospel. He's been telling these parables like we just looked at. But now is the dividing point, and he's getting ready to head towards Jerusalem, which means he is heading towards the crucifixion. So this is what he does. He picks up in verse 21, and it says, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law." Now those should be the guys that are on his side, but they're not. And so he's going to suffer at their hands. And then it says, "And he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life." Verse 22, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Now I want to get you in this mind. It wasn't just Jesus says this, and then Peter said in front of the crowd, in front of the other disciples says, "No, Lord, that's not going to happen." I mean, the way that the language reads is that it says that he took him aside, almost like he grabbed his arm and said, "Okay, Jesus, let's come on over here. We need to have a talk about this." And so he pulls Jesus aside and says, "Jesus, no, this is never going to happen to you." He goes on, and Jesus says in verse 23, one of the most powerful words, some of the most disturbing words that Jesus says to Peter. He says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." And there's a sermon written in this all together. Before this, Peter, we looked at 2 weeks ago, Peter looked and said, "You are the Christ, you're the Son of the living God." And Jesus looks back at him and says, "This wasn't revealed to you by men, this is revealed to you by God." But in this moment, Peter gets in the flesh. He gets in the flesh, and sometimes you and I, sometimes we get in the flesh and we say things and we do things that are not God's will for our life. And so at this moment, Peter gets in the flesh. He doesn't understand the will of God. It wasn't revealed to him by the Father. It's revealed by his own opinion. And so there's something to be said here that he's looking inside himself, and it's not the direction that Jesus wants to go. And then in verse 24 is where we're going to hang out this morning. It says, Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will gain it. What good is it for a man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man," talking about himself, "is going to come in his Father's glory with the angels," just like Denise just sang about, "and then he will reward each person according to what he has done. I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." And so here's what I want you to do. I want you to grab your notes with me, and I want you to write this down as your very first note. That what he's talking about here is being a disciple of Jesus comes at a cost. Being a disciple of Jesus comes at a cost. And so I want us to understand this morning that each and every one of us in this room, we are not saved by good works. Your salvation, the opportunity to spend your eternity with Jesus in heaven, the opportunity to be filled with this Holy Spirit, to have your identity found in Christ, to have God actually living inside of you, doesn't cost you a thing. It's free. It's absolutely free. And I'm so glad that it's free because Jesus paid the price when he died on the cross for you and for me. We're not saved by good works. However, we are saved for good works. God doesn't save you and give you a license to go do whatever you want. It's kind of like when you got your driver's license. You don't get a driver's license so that you can drive recklessly all over the road. No, that's not why you get a driver's license. You get a driver's license, again, you can have freedom. You have freedom to go wherever you want to go. It's the same with your salvation. A lot of people think, oh, well, if I get saved, I'm going to have all these limitations put on my life. I can't do this, can't do that, can't do this. And no, that's not it at all. It's a license that frees you up, but it's not a license to be reckless. It's a license that God gives you so that you can live for him and do good works for him. I think about the one time that I got a scholarship for school, and I didn't do anything to earn that scholarship. It was just a man in our hometown, and he said, man, that sounds, he heard about me, and he gave me this scholarship. I didn't do anything to earn that scholarship. But you know what? He expects something of me. He expects me to get through those classes, make good grades, and then after that, to do what God has called me to do. It's the same way in our life. We're not saved by good works. It's absolutely free. But we are saved for good works so that we can live for the glory of God. And so here's what I want us to do. I want us to home in on verse 24. I want us to see, after Jesus has rebuked Peter, I want us to really break down verse 24 and really ask the question, how can we apply this to our life 2,000 years later? And so Jesus comes on the scene after having this conversation with Peter, and he says, then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself. So the first thing that I want you to see in your notes, that first little price tag. What are we saved to do? What are we saved for? That first price tag is self-denial. Self-denial. William Barclay said it this way: to deny oneself means that in every moment of life, to say no to self and yes to God. To deny oneself means to dethrone yourself and enthrone God. We've talked about this before. Every person in this room, in your heart, there's a throne. And either you are on that throne or God is on that throne. And so for us, what does it mean to deny yourself? It means that you take yourself off the throne of your life and that you give God complete control. Do you remember those Tom and Jerry cartoons? We were watching those while we were on vacation. It kind of reminded me of this. Remember the Tom and Jerry cartoons? And sometimes the characters would have to make a decision, and on one shoulder would pop this angel. And then on the other shoulder would pop this demon, and they'd both be whispering in their ear, okay, do this, don't do that. Well, it's a little bit like that, except it's not an angel and a demon on your shoulder. It's you and God. It's your flesh. It's what you want to do. It's what you desire to do. And then there's God who is speaking into your heart. He's speaking into your life. And the way that the Bible describes it, the way Paul describes this in the book of Romans, is he actually describes it as a war that's taking place within him. Have you ever felt like that? You've ever been tempted to do something that you don't want to do, and it almost feels like there's a war taking place? All of that comes back to the price of self-denial. Am I going to put myself on the throne, or am I going to put God on the throne? And so what Jesus comes here on the scene, he says, if anyone wants to come after me, he has to deny himself. He's got to take himself off the throne and put me on the throne. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way. Maybe when you think self-denial or denying yourself, maybe you kind of think of that like going on a diet. You ever thought about that? You think of denying yourself, you think of that going on that rabbit food diet, where you give up carbs, you give up fat, you give up sugar, you give up everything with taste, okay? And then you go on to have that rabbit food diet with lettuce and carrots and all those different things. And I'm definitely not knocking that. I've just never rolled a piece of broccoli in my mouth and gone, oh, Man, that is good stuff. I've never had that happen to me. And a lot of people look at their relationship with God like that. They think self-denial is giving that up for this, giving up all the sugar, all the good stuff for a relationship with God. And it's not like that at all. Denying oneself is choosing, listen to this, to feast on God rather than the junk food of this world. That's what self-denial is. God has laid before us a feast to feast on Him and not live on the junk food of the world. It's choosing the friendship of a lifetime rather than a one-night stand. That's what God wants. He wants to give us we've been talking about everlasting results. He wants to satisfy us completely. And we could list off a million different ways that you could deny yourself, denying of drugs or alcohol or sex outside of marriage or blowing your money. But at the end of the day, I think about bankers and how they recognize counterfeit money. Do you know how bankers recognize counterfeit money? They've spent so much time around the real thing that they go, you know what, that's counterfeit, that's not real. And that's what God calls us to deny ourselves, is that we are so satisfied by feasting on the real thing, by feasting on God Himself, that we recognize a counterfeit right off. But if we've been feasting on junk food, if we've been feasting on the counterfeit for so long, then we won't know the real thing. And God calls us to know what the real thing. When you choose to deny yourself, you are choosing the real thing. You're choosing what really satisfies. That's how missionaries can go live in huts or war-torn areas. That's how people can put their lives on the line for the gospel. That's how they can put their families on the line. It's because they've tasted and seen that God is so good. And they go, nothing else satisfies. I've tried. Nothing else satisfies the way that God satisfies. And He comes on the scene and He says, choose to deny yourself. But the second thing that Jesus says, He says He must deny Himself. That's the first price. But then He goes on to the second price that I want you to write down here. It says, take up His cross. Take up His cross. So I want you to write down sacrifice. There's a second price of sacrifice. Now, the cross in Jesus' day meant a whole lot different than the cross does in our day. In our day, people wear crosses around their neck. People get tattoos of crosses. We use them in churches, like we've got one here this morning. Sometimes you might see them on a steeple. Sometimes people use them in decoration for their home. So crosses, while we understand what they mean, they're used a little bit differently. Here's the deal. I've never seen a person die on a cross before my very eyes. Have you? I've never seen someone die on a cross before my very eyes. And when Jesus looks at the disciples here and He says, deny yourself, take up your cross, they had seen people literally die on a cross. I was reading an article in Newsweek that came out back in April, and it said by the time of Jesus' crucifixion, the crucifixion was a staple of the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire, its justice system employed things, this is kind of brutal, but strangling, stoning, burning, and even boiling in oil of methods of torture and execution. I mean, the Roman government did not play. If you were against the Roman government, then they would absolutely snuff that out. But here's the deal. This is what Newsweek said. But crucifixion sent a more lingering message because crucifixion was used as a political weapon. So get in your mind. There were times that there were rebellions that would take place in the Roman government, and they would literally crucify thousands of people along a roadside because they were making a statement. And so it was used to make this political statement. And so Jesus is now talking to the guys that are closest to Him. And He says, if anybody wants to follow me, they've got to deny themselves and take up a cross. And so here, when they would hear the word cross, this is what would come to their mind. So what does that mean? What does it mean to take up your cross? It simply means this: to be willing to pay any price for Jesus' sake. It's the willingness to endure shame. It's a willingness to endure embarrassment, reproach, rejection, persecution, even martyrdom for the name's sake of Jesus Christ. And I just want to let you know, this is true. If you want to follow Jesus Christ, you are going to have to take up a cross. As I was reading this, I felt like so many names came to my mind throughout the Bible. Do you realize that many of the people in the Bible who are listed and who are known for their faith, and they're known for being men and women of God, do you realize that they had to take up a cross? I mean, let's just think about it. What was Abraham's cross? God asked him to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. Can you imagine? He had to take up a cross in order to do that. Now, at the end game, he didn't wind up sacrificing Isaac. God said, and now I see your faith. And generations from now, they will have seen your faith. But he had to take up that cross. Let's think of Moses. Can you imagine spending 40 years in the desert with a bunch of complainers? Now, some people do that in churches. But can you imagine 40 years with a bunch of complainers that are never satisfied? Moses had to take up a cross in order to follow God. What was Noah's cross? To spend a couple of 100 days with animals in close quarters? His family in close quarters? What if we stuck your family in close quarters for a couple of 100 days and we let it rain? It happened to Hurricane Isaac. Oh man, I was inside for a week and I couldn't handle it anymore. But they stuck him in close quarters. That was his cross. What was Joseph's cross? Being sold into slavery. Think about that. So you're trying to live for God. You're trying to do what God has told you. He's sold into slavery, and then he's thrown in jail for a crime that he didn't commit. Sometimes, have you ever asked this question, God, what are you doing? What are you doing? You might be there this morning. You might be saying, God, what are you doing with my life? God, what's going on? God calls us to take up a cross. Think of David's cross, running from Saul, running for his life from King Saul, or Daniel's cross, thrown into a lion's den for praying to the true God. Every great person in the Bible has a cross. Every great person in the Bible has a cross that they were willing to carry. And you know what? They didn't like it. And I think so many times that you might hear, okay, I've been called to carry a cross and I'm supposed to like it. No, I can't think of one of those situations where they liked it. I would go so far to say Jesus, when he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, saying, God, if there's any other way to save the world, then let this cup pass from me. Jesus didn't want to take up his own cross. No one likes taking up their own cross. You know how you take up your own cross? You know how you endure the cross that has been laid on you? You realize there's a resurrection. You realize that there's a resurrection, that if you take up that cross, that if you say, okay, God, I'm going to bear my cross, I'm going to take it up, whatever it is, I'm going to sacrifice whatever it is. There's a resurrection. All of these people that I just listed, there was a resurrection. There was a better day for them. Even if that day is in heaven, even for Jesus, there was a resurrection. I want you to hear loud and clear that yes, if you want to follow Jesus, that you will have to bear a cross. It is tough. It is hard. But I will say this, there is a resurrection at the end of this. I think Philippians spells this out beautiful where it talks about Jesus being on the cross. And it said, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorned its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. What does that passage tell me? It tells me that when I take up my cross, that God rewards a cross bearer. I want to encourage you that if you want to follow God, you've got to take up a cross. But then there's one last thing that I don't want us to miss this morning. Don't want us to miss. It's that third thing. It says this in verse 24. Let's just read it all the way through. Then Jesus came to his disciples. If anyone would come after me, he has to deny himself, take up his cross, and he has to follow me. And the third thing that I want you to see is that your third price is to shadow Jesus. You've got to shadow Jesus. What does that mean? You step where he steps. If he goes to the left, you go to the left. If he goes to the right, then you go to the right. Well, you might be in here this morning and say, well, Pastor Dan, I can't physically see Jesus. What does that mean? What does that mean in my life? Well, that's exactly what we do each and every day, spending time in God's Word. That's what Everlasting Results is all about, taking care of our temple, spending time in prayer. Essentially, it's this: if you want to shadow Jesus, you've got to spend time with Him. You're not going to shadow someone that you don't spend time with. Unfortunately, what I see is that I don't see too many Christians shadowing Jesus. I don't see them following Jesus like this passage is talking about here. I see them kind of like Peter in this passage, taking Jesus aside and saying, you know what, I'm not going to change. I'm not going to go in this new direction that you want me to go. I'm not going to let go of the past. I'm not going to let go of my opinions. I'm not going to let go of my insecurities. I'm not going to let go of my prejudices. I'm not going to pick up my Bible. I'm not going to bend my knees in prayer. I'm not going to get outside my comfort zone. I'm not going to go to that new church. I'm not going to go to the mission field. I'm not going to let go of my kid. I'm not. And how many of us that Jesus is calling us to follow Him, and we're standing there like this with our hands in our pockets, and all He's saying is step where I step, follow me, do what I've called you to do. And do you remember what Jesus said to Peter when He said, no, I'm not going to go in that direction. I'm not going to follow you in that direction. This is some of the most haunting words to me. Look at what Jesus said. He calls him Satan. He calls him Satan. But then I want you to see this. Look at right after that in verse 23. He says, get behind me, Satan. But this is what He says. You are a stumbling block to me. That's haunting. To think that what I might do be a stumbling block to what Jesus wants to do. To be a stumbling block to the mission. See, when we choose not to follow Jesus, many times we choose to get in front of Jesus. And when we do that, we make decisions that hurt the cause of Christ, that hurt others. And I want us to hear loud and clear that Jesus wants us to step where He steps. This week, this summer, I want you to step where Jesus is stepping. I want you to take up your cross. I want you to deny yourself. Jesus doesn't want you to hurt His mission. I'm going to ask for our praise band to come back up as we get ready to have a time of invitation. You know, I last week was Memorial Day, and this last Monday was Memorial Day, and so did a little research this week. I don't know about you. Sometimes I enjoy studying about war, and it's just history in general is just so interesting to me. And I've been learning about different planes and things like that, different ways of warfare and whatnot. And so it's interesting. I came across an article, not this one, but I came across an article almost a year ago to the day of how some missions have gone wrong because of friendly fire. Do you know what friendly fire is? It's really not friendly, okay? It's fire. It's essentially when you're firing on your own troops. And I found an article about a group of men called the Lost Battalion. And this happened almost 100 years ago. It was in 1918. It was essentially 554 men who got isolated by German forces during World War I. And then after an American attack, they got stuck in something called the Argonne Forest in October of 1918. And 197 men were killed. I mean, that's almost half of the men were killed. And approximately 150 were missing and then or taken prisoner. And then there's these 194 that are just remaining in the forest during World War I. And so they're spending time there. And it said in the article, it said that the battalion suffered all kinds of hardships. I mean, you can imagine. Talked about they were short on food and water. It was only available by crawling under fire in order to get to a nearby stream. Their ammunition ran low. Their communications were a problem. Listen to this. You know, we're in a world of cell phones and all kinds of different communication. At times they were bombarded by shells from their own artillery. And every runner dispatched either became lost or ran into the Germans, so they had to start using carrier pigeons. That became the only method of communication for them with headquarters. And they had this incident that happened on the 4th of October where some inaccurate coordinates were delivered by one of the pigeons. And so they experienced friendly fire. All this friendly fire just started falling on them. And so this is what they wrote. This was written on one of the carrier pigeons. It said, "We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." And I thought about that, how this carrier pigeon, and I thought about how so many times we have friendly fire. We're a stumbling block to the mission. We're a stumbling block to what God wants to do. And then it goes on to say that if you want to save your life, then you'll actually lose it. But if you lose your life, then you'll save it. Peter didn't understand, but Jesus spelled it out very clear that he wanted us to be men and women of self-denial, men and women of sacrifice, and men and women who shadow Jesus, who doesn't get the message wrong, and who understand that we are doing a mission, and that God has called us to do a mission. Let me tell you, in order to do that mission, you gotta enlist. I want to ask you this morning, are you ready for the mission? Have you enlisted? Have you ever given your heart and life to Jesus Christ? Has there ever been a moment in your life where you said, "God, I surrender, and I want to give my heart, I want to give my life to you"? Maybe that you've done that. Maybe you say, "You know what, Pastor Dan, there was a moment in my life where I got saved. I asked Jesus to forgive me of all my sins, and I asked him to come in, but Pastor Dan, I'm not living for the mission. I'm standing still while Jesus has called me to follow him. And I want to be a man, I want to be a woman, I want to be a dad, I want to be a mom, I want to be a person in this world where my life has significance. I don't want to get to the end of my life and go, man, it's wasted. I mean, it was fun, but it's all wasted. I want to be at the end of my life and say, you know what, I made a difference. There's only one way that can happen, is if you surrender to Jesus. This morning, as we get ready to have a time of invitation, I just want to ask, have you surrendered first and foremost your heart to Jesus and ask him to come in and take over control? The second question that I want to ask you is, who's on the throne of your heart this morning? Maybe that you're saved and you go, "But Pastor Dan, I'm really on the throne of my heart this morning." How about we get an opportunity before this summer really gets kicked off? Say, "You know what, God, take my summer and use it however you want." Let's bow and have a word of prayer as we go into